1. Kelsey Nicole Turner. Kelsey Nicole Turner was a former glamour model in her mid-20s at the time of her arrest, known for appearances tied to men's magazines, and for an online persona that blended allure with ambition. She had come to Las Vegas projecting the image of a rising influencer, while friends and followers saw stylish photos and modeling clips that suggested momentum and success. Behind that image, prosecutors later said a California psychiatrist named Thomas Burchard was helping cover her rent and lifestyle, a financial arrangement they described as intimate and transactional. Pressure had been building for months. According to reporting and court statements, Burchard's support wavered, and he decided to visit Turner in early March of 2019 to confront the situation in person. The trip put private tensions into a shared space where money, trust, and fraying loyalties collided. Turner's social image as Bad Barbie burnished her visibility, but it also drew attention to the gap between the life on screen and the finances required to maintain it. Days later, a car was discovered abandoned on a dirt road outside Las Vegas near the Lake Mead National Recreation Area. Inside the trunk, investigators found Burchard's body. Forensic evidence and witness accounts would point detectives back to the Las Vegas home Turner shared with her then-boyfriend, John Kennison, and a roommate, Diana Pena. Officials described signs of a violent confrontation and cleanup efforts that moved from the house to the vehicle, tracing a path through towel supplies and a bat consistent with blunt force injuries, while avoiding the kind of details too disturbing for public broadcast. The case accelerated quickly. Police connected the abandoned blue Mercedes-Benz to Turner, gathered forensic links tying the occupants to the scene, and documented movements in the hours after Burchard was reported missing by his longtime partner. Pena cooperated early, pleading guilty to being an accessory and telling authorities she helped clean the house before leaving town with Turner and Kennison. The investigative picture that emerged placed all three in the same orbit as the victim during those crucial days, strengthening a narrative of shared involvement. Court proceedings stretched on as the public followed a story that combined celebrity gloss with ordinary human heartbreak. In late autumn of 2022, Turner entered what is known as an Alford plea to second-degree murder, maintaining her innocence while acknowledging the state had enough evidence to secure a conviction. That plea avoided a trial and set the stage for sentencing in early January of the following year. At sentencing, the judge heard from Burchard's longtime partner, whose statement captured the grief and disbelief felt by family and friends, and from lawyers who argued over responsibility and motive. Prosecutors reiterated that the relationship between Turner and Burchard had been financial as well as personal, a dynamic they argued turned volatile when money and expectations collided. Separately, Kennison had already pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and conspiracy and received a lengthy term. Pena awaited her own sentencing for her role as an accessory. Observers and experts have described the case as driven by a mix of financial dependency, escalating conflict, and the pressures of a public persona sustained by private funds. The prosecution's framing of a transactional bond coupled with accounts of deception and control offered a window into how status, fear of loss, and sudden confrontation can amplify risk. It is a portrait less of a calculated mastermind than of a fragile arrangement collapsing under scrutiny, resulting in irrevocable harm. Turner was sentenced in Las Vegas to a term of 10 to 25 years for second-degree murder and is currently serving her sentence in Nevada. 2. Courtney Taylor Clenny. Courtney Taylor Clenny was 26 years old when police said a luxury Miami condo became the final stage of a relationship that had been fraying for months. Known online as an OnlyFans and fitness model under the name Courtney Taylor, she had crafted a glossy public image powered by fashion shoots, sponsorships, and a steady stream of social posts. Friends and former neighbors later described a young woman chasing celebrity while navigating a volatile romance with Christian Tobio Bumsley, a cryptocurrency worker her age. Prosecutors would soon allege that the private reality behind those posts looked very different from the public persona, and the fault lines were visible well before the killing. Security footage released by prosecutors shows Clenny striking Obumseli in an elevator weeks before his death, an episode they cited as evidence of a stormy pattern. The Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office publicly described the couple as tempestuous and combative, while the defense countered that Clenny was the one living in fear. People who knew them said arguments were frequent and intense. In interviews and filings, both sides invoked domestic violence dynamics to explain what happened next, underscoring a relationship that had become chaotic and unsafe. On a Sunday in early April of 2020, 2 officers were called to the One Paraiso Tower in the Edgewater neighborhood after a frantic 911 call from the couple's apartment. Obumseli had suffered a single stab wound from a kitchen knife. Clenny told investigators she had thrown the knife from a distance after being pushed to the floor. The medical examiner's findings, however, were described by prosecutors as inconsistent with a thrown knife scenario, setting up a central dispute that has defined the case. The recording of the emergency call and later released body camera footage captured Clenny, sounding panicked and apologetic, adding emotional complexity, but not resolving the conflicting narratives. 4 months later, Clenny was arrested on the Big Island of Hawaii on a Miami warrant and extradited to Florida to face a charge of second-degree murder. A Miami-Dade judge later denied her request for release, and she has remained in jail as pretrial litigation unfolded. Clenny has pleaded not guilty and maintains she acted in self-defense. Her legal team has pressed a series of motions, including a bid to disqualify the Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office over its handling of evidence, a request that drew additional attention in the spring of 2025. The investigation spread beyond the homicide file. In early 2024, Miami-Dade prosecutors announced arrests of Clenny's parents in Texas on allegations of unauthorized access to the victim's laptop, and Clenny herself was charged with a related computer access count. Some of those issues later saw courtroom challenges and partial setbacks for the state. Meanwhile, Obumseli's family pursued a civil wrongful death suit, and public debate intensified as additional audio, video, and court documents were released. For those close to Obumseli, grief and disbelief remained palpable at each hearing and news update. Motives in this case have been framed through clashing lenses. Prosecutors describe a cycle of escalating aggression and control inside a high-pressure, high-visibility lifestyle, arguing that jealousy and volatility culminated in a fatal confrontation. The defense portrays a woman overwhelmed by a larger, stronger partner during a sudden conflict who reacted in fear, insisting the evidence will show self-defense. Independent observers have noted that the relationship history, the elevator video, and the forensic dispute over a thrown versus driven blade will likely be pivotal at trial, with psychological interpretations focusing less on cold-blooded calculation than on a toxic spiral fueled by anger, insecurity, and public-private mismatch. As of now, Courtney Taylor Clenny remains held without bond in Miami-Dade custody, awaiting trial on a charge of second-degree murder in the death of Christian Toby Obumseli. 3. Tara Lambert. Tara Lambert was 32 years old, a former fashion model from Central Ohio, when a private family dispute spilled into public view and then into a courtroom. In her circle, she was known for pageants and photo shoots, for the polish of small-town celebrity, and for being a new stepmother. Behind the scenes, she and her husband were locked in conflict with his ex over parenting time for 2 school-age daughters, a tug-of-war that brought stress, jealousy, and constant argument. Prosecutors would later say that the custody pressure and resentment toward the children's mother formed the backdrop to what came next. Those closest to Lambert described a woman straining to keep control of a chaotic life. A defense psychologist testified that she carried unresolved wounds from childhood, struggled with eating disorders and body image issues, and misused alcohol and prescription medication. Another expert called her developmentally damaged, and her lawyer argued that she was emotionally fragile and easily pushed. Whatever the framing, the portrait that emerged was of someone whose self-presentation as poised and glamorous sat uneasily on top of fear, insecurity, and erratic judgment. The turning point came in the summer of 2015. Looking for a way to remove her husband's ex from their lives, Lambert confided in a former school friend, asking whether anyone would be willing to take care of the problem. The friend went to authorities, and an undercover deputy arranged a meeting with Lambert at a fast food restaurant. On recording, Lambert handed over a photograph of the target and typed notes listing and address vehicle descriptions and daily routines. She paid a down payment of $125 and, in a chilling aside, made a disturbing suggestion about disposing of a body using heavy equipment. She would later claim she had been joking, but detectives had what they needed. Officers moved in shortly after the meeting and took her into custody. In the winter that followed, a jury heard the tapes, considered her explanations, and convicted her of 1 count of conspiracy to commit aggravated murder, while acquitting her of a second related charge. The judge imposed a prison term of 7 years, and in victim statements, the family described fear disruption in the sense that their household had been under siege. Lambert told the court she was not a monster, that things had spiraled, and that she wished she had sought help. Sooner words that did not change the sentence, but added to the emotional weight of the proceeding. The case did not end there. In early summer of the next year, an appeals court threw out the conviction because of a flaw in the charging document's language, an error that judges said should have halted the original prosecution. Prosecutors re-indicted Lambert the following winter, and by midsummer of the next year, she entered a guilty plea to conspiracy to commit aggravated murder. The court imposed a 5-year sentence, crediting the time she had already served after the first trial. Coverage at the time noted a projected release date in early spring of 2022 based on state records. Forensic recordings, the undercover sting, and the paper trail she supplied became the core of the prosecution's case. The defense narrative centered on her mental health history, vulnerability to suggestion, and the toxic blend of jealousy and custody conflict. Experts and reporters alike described a convergence of personal instability and situational pressure rather than a sophisticated plotter. What remains indisputable is the paper-thin line between fantasy and action. In this case, a line crossed the moment cash. A photograph and instructions changed hands. Lambert ultimately pleaded guilty in Pickaway County to conspiracy to commit aggravated murder and received a 5-year prison sentence with credit for time served. 4. Omaima Ari Nelson. Omaima Ari Nelson was 23 years old, an Egyptian-American former model, and nanny living in Orange County when a whirlwind courtship ended in a newlywed apartment, and soon after a death that stunned California. Friends and former acquaintances later described a young woman who moved easily through bars and social circles, projecting glamour and confidence while seeking stability after immigrating to the United States. Behind that public face, prosecutors and reporters traced a complicated personal history and a volatile new marriage to William Bill Nelson, a radio enthusiast in his mid-50s. Tensions had been building long before the holiday weekend that changed everything. In court, the defense portrayed Omaima as a survivor of long-term mistreatment, arguing that earlier relationships and her brief marriage to Bill included controlling and abusive dynamics. She wept on the stand as she described fear and coercion, and her attorney invoked battered woman syndrome to explain her state of mind. A psychiatrist testifying for the defense later suggested she might have been experiencing a psychotic break during the killing. The prosecution rejected those claims, insisting the acts reflected intent rather than panic. Over Thanksgiving in late November of 1991, inside their Costa Mesa apartment, a violent confrontation turned fatal. What followed was extraordinary, not for a grisly description here, but for the extraordinary allegations surrounding it. Investigators and later courtroom testimony asserted that the body was dismembered and that some parts were cooked. A psychiatrist said Omaima privately claimed to have consumed a portion, a statement she later denied. The emphasis in the coverage and in this retelling is on the alleged actions and the psychological shock they created rather than graphic detail. The investigation moved quickly. After the weekend, Omaima approached an acquaintance for help, disposing of evidence. He contacted police instead. Officers soon discovered trash bags containing remains in the apartment and in a vehicle tied to the couple, and they detained her on suspicion of murder. Early filings and news reports note that her explanations shifted under questioning, while forensic findings and witness accounts hardened the state's case. The narrative that emerged was of a killing inside the home, followed by hurried, calculated steps to conceal what had happened. A little more than a year later, a jury in Santa Ana found Omaima Nelson guilty of second-degree murder. The verdict acknowledged that the defense had raised allegations of abuse, yet concluded that the killing was not justified. At sentencing in early spring of 1993, the court imposed a term of 27 years to life. For the victim's family, the proceeding underlined the sense of betrayal that comes from a marriage turning catastrophic. For the public, the case became one of the county's most discussed crimes, its notoriety driven by the shocking allegations, the courtroom drama, and competing accounts of who held power inside the marriage. In the years that followed, parole boards revisited her case. At a hearing in early October of 2011, commissioners at the Central California Women's Facility heard apologies but cited a lack of accountability and ongoing public safety concerns in denying release. Officials said her next opportunity would not come until the mid-2020s. Through counsel and in statements, Omaima continued to assert that she acted in self-defense and that trauma shaped her responses during and after the killing. Analysts looking back describe a convergence of factors, a brief combustible relationship, a private world of alleged coercion and retaliation, and a defendant whose psychological portrait oscillated between traumatized and calculating. The trial record and later parole decisions suggest that whatever the emotional currents, the planning and concealment weighed heavily with jurors and officials alike. Today, Omaima Ari Nelson remains incarcerated in California, serving a sentence of 27 years to life, with parole previously denied. 5. Ruth Ellis. Ruth Ellis was 28 years old, a Welsh-born photographic model and nightclub hostess in post-war London, when a love affair spiraled into a public tragedy. To patrons and friends, she projected poise and platinum blonde glamour, the face of a woman who knew how to work a crowded room. In private, she was a young mother of two, trying to hold together money worries and demanding shifts, and a volatile romance with David Blakely, a charming, hard-living racing enthusiast from a more privileged world. Their relationship, intense and uneven, would soon eclipse the persona she showed the city at night. Those who later sifted the record found a pattern of turmoil and alleged abuse. Contemporary files and later analysis describe Blakely striking her and Ellis suffering a miscarriage shortly before the shooting, an experience her supporters said left her distraught and unstable. She was also spending time with Desmond Cusson, an older admirer who, according to accounts, became both confidant and facilitator in the days before the killing. These pressures, emotional, physical, and social, simmered beneath the surface of a woman whose livelihood depended on composure. On Easter Sunday, in early April of 1955, the private crisis broke into the open on a Hampstead pavement outside the Magdala pub. Ellis waited near the doorway of a newsagent as Blakely emerged with a friend. In the moments that followed, she drew a revolver from her handbag and fired several shots at close range. A bystander called for help. An off-duty officer stepped in and placed her under arrest almost immediately. She is reported to have asked that the police be called and did not flee. The weapon would later take its place behind glass in the Metropolitan Police's Crime Museum, a mute artifact of a few irreversible seconds. Detectives quickly charted the triangle that had framed Ellis's final weeks, the stormy liaison with Blakely, the parallel connection to Cusson, and the evidence trail pointing to planning as well as rage. When the case reached the Old Bailey in early summer, the proceedings were swift. Prosecutor Christmas Humphreys asked Ellis what she intended when she fired. Her stark reply left little room for nuance under the law of the day. The jury returned a guilty verdict after a brief retirement, and the mandatory penalty followed. Headlines and street conversations turned to whether a reprieve might yet come. Public response was immediate and unusually intense. Petitions and letters poured into the Home Office pleading for clemency, while editorials argued over whether a woman with a history of violence at home should die on the scaffold. Scholars have since noted that the law then offered narrow avenues to recognize the effects of prolonged abuse. Only later, with the Homicide Act of the late 1950s, would diminished responsibility and a broader view of provocation alter how such cases could be judged. In Ellis's era, the rules were tighter, and the hourglass moved quickly. In the years since, historians have argued over motive and mindset. Some see premeditation in the way a gun entered the story, and in Ellis's own words, under cross-examination. Others emphasize a battered woman overwhelmed by rejection, humiliation, and fear, acting in a moment of desperate emotional collapse. What is certain is the cultural aftershock the case became a touchstone in Britain's long debate over capital punishment, and how the justice system hears women whose relationships turn violent. Ruth Ellis was convicted of murder, and in mid-July of 1955 hanged at Holloway Prison, the last woman executed in Britain. 6. Abigail White. Abigail White was in her mid-20s, an online model known to followers as Fake Barbie, when a volatile relationship with Bradley Lewis veered from public posts to private crisis. In South Gloucestershire, she juggled the image of a confident, neon-bright persona with the daily reality of co-parenting and financial strain. Friends and prosecutors alike would later describe a romance marked by jealousy, alcohol-fueled arguments, and sudden reconciliations. In court filings and coverage, she was identified as a creator on a subscription platform whose notoriety often eclipsed the quieter details of her home life. The months before the killing were punctuated by breakups and threats. Voice notes recovered by investigators captured her saying she believed herself capable of serious harm if she felt betrayed statements that prosecutors used to show escalating intent. On the day that proved fatal, witnesses and security footage placed the couple at a neighborhood pub where a dispute spilled into slaps, shouting, and a confrontation with another patron. Accounts presented at trial said she drank heavily and used cocaine, then fumed that Bradley had not defended her. When he told her he wanted to end the relationship, the emotional temperature spiked from simmer to boil. That evening, back at her home in Kingswood, the argument continued. Moments later, Bradley suffered a single chest wound from a kitchen knife. A neighbor heard screams and called for help. Within minutes, White told others that Bradley had hurt himself, a claim she repeated to police and hospital staff, before later admitting she had delivered the blow. Paramedics rushed him to a Bristol hospital where he died soon after. The timeline, the changing explanations, and the earlier voice notes formed the backbone of the case that detectives presented to prosecutors. The investigation moved quickly into court. White pleaded guilty to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility, but a jury at Bristol Crown Court convicted her of murder. In detailed sentencing remarks, the judge cited past violence within the relationship, prior threats, and her own statements about intending to kill, concluding that her claim she only meant to frighten Bradley was not credible. The court imposed a life sentence with a minimum term measured in 18 years before parole consideration. Local coverage captured the grief of Bradley's family as they addressed the court and the community that had rallied around them. Psychologically, the portrait that emerged was complicated. Experts for both sides agreed she met criteria for a borderline personality disorder rooted, they said, in significant early trauma, with symptoms that included fear of abandonment and volatile reactions to perceived rejection. The judge acknowledged her mental health and lack of long premeditation as mitigating factors while emphasizing the history of coercive controlling behavior and the reality that she had previously used a knife in the relationship. Detectives later described her conduct as inherently volatile, arguing that the jury saw through shifting accounts offered in the immediate aftermath. Public response focused on domestic abuse dynamics, the role of alcohol and drugs, and the distance between social media performance and private danger. Coverage noted earlier incidents that had sent Bradley to seek medical help, and the way friends had tried to keep him from going home that night, fearing what might happen. In interviews after the verdict, his father spoke about the hole left in their family and thanked the community for its support, underscoring the human cost behind headlines about a model and an online persona. Abigail White is serving a life sentence with a minimum term of 18 years for the murder of Bradley Lewis. 7. Alicia Allen. Alicia Allen was 28 years old, a former glamour model living in the Nottinghamshire town of Hucknall, when a turbulent relationship with Carl Bloxham crossed a line that could not be undone. To acquaintances, she seemed confident and stylish. To those closer in the couple's life, at a flat on Spruce Grove was marked by arguments that flared and cooled the kind of volatility that leaves friends uneasy. They had been together for about 5 years, a span of reconciliations and ruptures that set the stage for what followed. Stressors had been accumulating. In court, lawyers and reporters described alcohol misuse and a diagnosis consistent with an emotionally unstable personality disorder, a combination that can intensify fear of abandonment and magnify conflict. Mitigation later highlighted a difficult upbringing and a pattern of fragile mental health, while prosecutors countered that the instability had long shown itself in controlling and aggressive behavior. The picture that emerged was of a young woman projecting poise while struggling with dependency, insecurity, and escalating emotion behind closed doors. In late July of 2015, the simmer became a boil. After an argument at a neighborhood pub and a message signaling the end of the relationship, the pair returned to their shared flat in Hucknall. Inside the kitchen, a confrontation turned sudden and irreversible. Allen used a kitchen knife and delivered a single wound to Bloxham's chest. Shock seemed to follow rage. She contacted emergency services, and responders rushed him to a hospital in nearby Nottingham, where he died later that night. Detectives would later focus on the sequence, the breakup message, the return to the flat, the brief and fatal burst of violence, as they assembled a timeline for prosecutors. From there, the case moved quickly through the system. Allen was charged, and the following year at Nottingham Crown Court, she pleaded guilty to murder. The judge emphasized that anger at being left rather than panic or accident explained the decision to pick up a knife. Family statements gave the courtroom a human center, a sister speaking of missed chances to say, "I love you," a father describing the loss of a son and of a best friend. The sentence followed English law's mandatory framework for murder life imprisonment with a minimum term set before parole can even be considered in her case, measured at 14 years. Public reaction in Nottinghamshire mixed sorrow, with a grim recognition of how quickly domestic conflict can escalate. Local outlets traced the couple's history and reported on social media posts and earlier incidents, while police statements urged attention to the warning signs that often precede lethal outcomes. Coverage noted that Allen had been signed to a modeling agency and once appeared in a men's magazine, details that amplified headlines but could not soften the absence felt by Bloxham's children and extended family. Within that media glare, detectives stressed a simple narrative spine, a volatile relationship, a breakup, a weapon at hand, and a fatal choice. Psychologically experts and advocates who looked at the proceedings saw a convergence of personality disorder traits, alcohol dependence, and a profound fear of rejection. Defense mitigation pointed to her being raised by a grandmother and to long-standing eating disorders, seeking to explain, if not excuse, the intensity of her responses. The judge acknowledged her mental health and remorse, including attempts to resuscitate Bloxham, yet concluded that the intent to cause serious harm was clear. That balance, recognizing impairment while affirming responsibility, framed the legal outcome and the continuing debate in the community. Alicia Allen is serving a life sentence with a minimum term of 14 years for the murder of Carl Bloxham. 8. Shirley Patricia Beiger. Shirley Patricia Beiger was 22 years old, a Sydney magazine model and frequent cover girl when a glamorous public image collided with a private life in turmoil. She had grown up in the city, navigating her parents' separation in a series of ordinary jobs before slipping into the world of fashion shoots and nightclub society. Photographs cast her as poised and luminous. Nightlife regulars knew her as soft-spoken and aspirational, a young woman reaching for a brighter stage than the one she was born to. Beneath the sheen were pressures that would later echo through courtroom testimony and cultural commentary. Accounts describe a relationship with Arthur Griffith that swung between devotion and distrust, shadowed by his attention to other women and her fear of losing him. Some who revisited the case decades later also pointed to early experiences that may have shaped her responses to conflict at home and to a society that offered few safe scripts for women confronting humiliation and control. In this reading, jealousy and shame were not simple sparks, but part of a longer fuse of frustration and longing. In early August of 1954, those tensions spilled into the open outside Checkers, a fashionable city nightclub. After seeing Griffith arrive with another woman, Biger left gathered his belongings, and according to later testimony, took a small caliber Browning repeater rifle from a neighbor before returning by car with her mother. On the street as Griffith approached the vehicle, the weapon fired. Biger would claim she was in the back seat and that the gun discharged when he leaned in and pushed her, while prosecutors pressed a narrative of anger and intent. She did not run. Witnesses and police quickly closed the scene, and the city awoke to headlines that turned a private triangle into a public spectacle. The investigation and inquest unfolded at speed. Contemporary reporting recorded a stark admission words to the effect of, "I shot him," and sketched a timeline that led from the nightclub to the curbside confrontation. By late spring of that year, the Central Criminal Court became a magnet for crowds, many of them women who queued for seats and traded updates on the defendant's composure and clothing as much as on the legal arguments. The performance of the city around the trial, its fascination and sympathy, became part of the story itself. When the case reached its climax, the jury's deliberation was brief. Reporters captured cheers in the courtroom and in the street outside as an all-male panel found Biger not guilty not only of murder but also of the lesser count of manslaughter. The verdict reflected, at least in part, the frame that had taken hold a young model tearful and contrite, insisting the shooting was accidental. The public's response, applause, shouts, and palpable relief underscored how fully the city had invested in her as a symbol as well as a defendant. What motivated her became a debate that outlived the headlines. Some researchers emphasize a storm of jealousy, betrayal, and the impulse to frighten a straying lover. Others point to the hints of intimidation in her testimony and the wider context of post-war expectations placed on women who sought independence in nightlife and modeling. Even supporters who believed the discharge was accidental acknowledged the deliberate decision to retrieve a gun, an act that made tragedy possible in a matter of seconds. After the verdict, Biger slipped from the spotlight, reportedly leaving Sydney and allowing the myth of the model who walked free to settle over the case. Shirley Patricia Biger was acquitted of murder and manslaughter in late 1954 and served no prison sentence. 9. Sarah May Ward. Sarah May Ward, in her late 30s and known locally as a former model, moved through Sydney's social scene with the confidence of someone used to being seen. Friends described a woman who could be charming and impulsive, in equal measure a personality that drew attention, but also friction. On the night that would define her life, those frictions found an outlet on a quiet stretch of road in the city's north. In the small hours of a June night in the late 2000s, Ward encountered a group of young men walking home in St. Leonard's. Among them was Eli Westlake, a rising musician in his early 20s. A harmless taunt escalated when cheese puff snacks were tossed at Ward's car. What could have been an irritating moment on the street spiraled into a confrontation. Ward had been drinking and, according to evidence presented in court, had also taken cannabis ecstasy and Valium before getting behind the wheel that night. The jury later heard that she returned to her vehicle, and after an initial pass, in which Westlake jumped clear, she reversed and accelerated toward the group a second time, Witnesses described a scene that was chaotic rather than graphic shouts, a lurching engine, and the sick realization that a split-second choice had turned catastrophic. Westlake's friends and his brother were just steps away, close enough to see the moments that followed, yet powerless to change them. In the aftermath, Ward told authorities she'd been afraid that her foot had slipped on the pedal and that a passenger had grabbed the wheel. Explanations the jury ultimately rejected. Investigators quickly pieced together the timeline with eyewitness accounts and Ward's own statements. In court, prosecutors argued that she had used the car as a weapon. The judge agreed, calling it a senseless act of anger, and noting that her intention was at least to injure and teach a lesson. The facts that night alcohol, drugs, confrontation, and a rash decision amplified by fury formed a pattern that spoke to impaired judgment and escalating rage more than to planning. Ward's defense pointed to intoxication and to an underlying mental disorder, arguments the jury did not accept. The human cost was laid bare at sentencing. Westlake's parents addressed the court through tears, describing a son with a generous spirit and a family whose daily life had been upended by grief. Their remarks captured the public mood, disbelief that a brief street encounter had ended in death, and a plea that the court recognized the severity of the choice that caused it. Psychologically, the case was often framed as an explosion of road rage under the influence of intoxicants, anger sparked by humiliation, then intensified by impaired control. The judge's language underscored that theory, emphasizing impulse and aggression in the seconds between the first pass and the fatal return. In later filings, Ward challenged the verdict, arguing errors in jury direction and appealing both conviction and sentence, but her legal position remained bound to what the court had already concluded about her intent and her state of mind. She was convicted of murder, given a maximum term of 25 years, with a non-parole period of 18 years and 9 months, and became eligible to seek parole in March of 2027. 10. Tamika Chesser. Tamika Suein Rose Chesser was in her mid-30s when a carefully curated public life collided with a shocking criminal allegation. An Australian reality TV alum and model, she first reached national attention as a contestant, later widely described as a runner-up on the second season of Beauty and the Geek in the early 2010s. Over the years, profiles and coverage linked her to glamour shoots, including work for international men's magazines, and to an online presence that projected ambition and self-reinvention. In the winter of that southern year, she was living in Port Lincoln with her partner, Julian Story, a local man in his late 30s. Police have not stated a clear motive. What is documented is a tense timeline and a rapid descent from routine to catastrophe. According to court filings and hearing notes, officers and neighbors encountered Chesser in a state described as catatonic and unresponsive, and magistrates ordered her held at James Nash House, a secure psychiatric facility, while investigators and doctors assessed her fitness to face proceedings. Officials emphasized that the case remained at an early stage, with Chesser yet to enter formal pleas on the most serious allegations and a further court date set for December. The investigative story begins in mid-June. Detectives allege that Story was killed around the middle of the month, and 2 days later, emergency crews responded to a small fire at the couple's unit. A neighbor reported smoke. Documents say Chesser told him nothing was wrong and walked away with her dogs, after which he went inside to douse smoldering debris. Police arrived and discovered partial remains inside the bathroom. From that point, major crime detectives appealed to the public, asking residents to review security camera images and dash cam footage that might show Chesser's movements between the early hours of a Tuesday and the following Thursday afternoon. What followed gripped the community. Officers released stills from security cameras and widened searches through bushland drains and shoreline. In late July, a dog walker came across human remains in scrub near Hinmarsh Street. Forensic testing later confirmed they belonged to Story. A development police called critical for both the investigation and the family's ability to lay him to rest. The discovery reinforced a central allegation that, in addition to an unlawful killing, there had been extensive post-mortem interference with the body. Chesser was arrested soon after the initial discovery and charged with murder. Prosecutors also filed ancillary counts, including allegations of destroying or interfering with human remains and assaulting an emergency worker, matters that were listed to be dealt with separately in the magistrate's court. Through it all, police reiterated that they were piecing together hours of public and private footage, seeking to reconstruct a tight window of time and to understand movements around the apartment complex and nearby streets. Community response was swift and somber vigils, statements of grief from Story's family, and a broad willingness to supply tips and footage to detectives. Psychologically, the case has been framed by officials in cautious terms. Detectives described an extremely confronting scene and asked the public to avoid speculation while evidence was gathered. Court reporting noted Chesser's presentation in custody and the decision to detain her under mental health provisions pending assessments, an approach that signals concern about her current state rather than a judicial conclusion about her intentions at the time of the alleged offense. Commentators have pointed to the gap between a glossy reality TV past and the isolation of a regional life. But investigators have stressed that any narrative about motive remains tentative until tested in a higher court. As of now, Tamika Swan Rose Chesser remains detained at James Nash House under mental health orders, charged with murder and related offenses, and is scheduled to return to court in December of 2025 while the investigation continues. 11. Yun-Lu Lee. Yun Lucy Lu Lee was in her mid-20s, a Canadian influencer whose online presence blended fashion shoots, travel snapshots, and curated glimpses of luxury. She sometimes appeared alongside her two sisters, a set of triplets who modeled together, with one sister competing in a Miss World Toronto pageant. The public image was polished and upwardly mobile, the kind of aspirational story that gathers followers and brand offers. In private, prosecutors would later say, her life intersected with a risky business circle through her boyfriend Oliver Carafa and a new partner named Tyler Pratt, a father and entrepreneur in his late 30s. According to The Crown, the relationship between Lee Carafa and Pratt soured over money. Jurors later heard that Pratt had poured a large investment into a venture fronted by Carafa, and that expectations of fast profits were unraveling. In the courtroom, the judge would characterize the motive as simple and chilling greed for a sum described as roughly $470,000. For Lee, who had cultivated an image of effortless success, those pressures formed the backdrop to a plan that prosecutors called deliberate and tightly staged. On a cold evening in late February of 2021, Lee and Carafa arranged a meeting behind a shop on Arvin Avenue in Stony Creek, part of Hamilton, Ontario. Pratt arrived with his fiancée, Jordan Romano, who was pregnant. The Crown said the pair were lured under the guise of business. Moments after they reached the industrial lot, gunfire erupted. Pratt died at the scene. Romano was gravely wounded, but survived, later telling the court that the injury cost her the pregnancy she had been carrying for 13 weeks. The images that linger from testimony are spare and haunting: a darkened lot, a sudden ambush, and a survivor who crawled for help. What followed was flight. Within about a day, Lee and Carafa left Canada for Europe. Hamilton police worked with international partners, tracking the couple across borders until authorities in Hungary arrested them in the capital city. Officers flew to Budapest and escorted Lee back to Canada. Carafa fought extradition before also returning to face charges. The arrest turned a local homicide into a national story, fusing the allure of social media celebrity with the stark machinery of an international manhunt. The case went to trial in the spring of 2024. Over several weeks, jurors heard from Romano and from Lee, whose testimony attempted to place all planning on Carafa and to recast herself as a bystander who fled in fear. Prosecutors countered that the evidence tied both accused to a coordinated plot, the meeting location, the timing, and the rapid escape. The jury returned verdicts of first-degree murder for Pratt's killing and attempted murder for the attack on Romano. In remarks from the bench, the judge called the crime an execution carried out for money and said it was hard to imagine a more calculated plan. Public response focused on the sharp contrast between an Instagram sheen and the violence described in court. Pratt's loved ones spoke about the hole left in their family and the secondary trauma of watching Romano relive the night she survived. Reporters noted that the case rested not on a sudden explosion, but on what the Crown framed as careful staging in service of financial desperation. Defense arguments suggested panic, misplaced trust, and manipulation inside a romantic partnership. The jury, faced with the total record, rejected those accounts. Yunlusi Luli now serves a life sentence in Canada for first-degree murder and attempted murder with no possibility of parole for 25 years under Canadian law. The attempted murder term of 15 years runs at the same time.